You're editing this, right? So this is Stephanie Russell, and you're listening to the St. Louis Speaks podcast. I am guest hosting today, and I am sitting in La Mancha Coffee House in Old North St. Louis with, and Ryan, I heard you pronounce your last name last night. It's Schuessler, right?
Schuessler, Ryan Schuessler.
Okay.
Yeah.
I didn't want to Schuessler it because I didn't think that was correct. So, and also Ann Trubek with Bell Publishing, and Ryan is the editor of the St. Louis Anthology, which is a brand new book out from Bell Publishing. Just came out June 4th. And Ann is the founder of Felt, which is a magazine and a publishing house, I guess it's accurate to. And
yep.
You live in Cleveland.
I do.
Okay, great. So Ryan's a Kirkwood native.
Yes.
And he lives in Chicago now, and he has this very cool job of developing exhibits for the Field Museum, right?
That's right. I've worked there for about 3 years.
Mm-hmm.
Grew up in Kirkwood. Went to school at Mizzou in Columbia, and moved to Chicago about 4 years ago.
And you've also written for lots of places.
Yeah, my background's in journalism. I started at the St. Louis Beacon when that was still around here as an intern in college. Do freelance work for The Guardian, The Washington Post, The New York Times, and a bunch of other publications here and there.
Right, and you write as well.
I do.
Yes.
Yep.
So, do you want to talk a little bit?
So I published a book which is not really in the same theme as what we're talking about today on the history and future of handwriting. Mm-hmm. And I've written a lot of articles and essays for the Times and the Post, places that Brian mentioned. But lately, I'm pretty much full-time focused on running Bell Publishing.
I just like to, I know editors are often writers, so I always like to give people credit for being writers as well. So I had kind of called out some sections of the anthology, but I wanted to talk about the structure first, because it's split into 3 sections. There's history, memories, and realities.
Yes.
And so I wanted to touch on how that came around, if that was organic, or if did that happen after you guys looked through all the stuff you had?
So that happened organically. When I did the call for submissions and was reading everything, I didn't have a structure in mind for the book. I accepted the pieces individually, keeping representation and voice, and wanted to make sure it was a good sampling of different voices across the city. And then once that selection was made, I was trying to figure out how to put them together, at the least in what order, without sections, or if there were going to be sections, what they would be. And I struggled with that for a really long time, because there were some really clear-cut sections, and then some that would only have one, and then like the leftover 10 that made no sense together at all. And so I looked at it a bit more abstractly and saw that there was a good chunk that were sort of historical background narratives of different communities or places, some that were written by individuals about a particular moment in their past, and then some that were sort of analysis of contemporary issues, or like set more in the present. And so once those 3 groups came together, it was pretty easy to sort things out.
And I wanted to ask you a little bit about the process of working with Ryan, because he came to you and said, why is there no St. Louis Anthology? This is an outrage, right?
Yeah, right, exactly. Yeah, so we have done, this is our 13th city anthology. And all of the books have, the same basic premise, which is to gather as many essays about a city as possible, to get a sort of snapshot of a place now, taking into account its past, but also looking really at the conditions of the city now and thoughts about the future. And the way that the anthologies get greenlit and get done is usually somebody reaches out and says, hey, I saw your Cleveland book. I would love to do a similar book for Detroit. And then the next person is like, hey, I saw your Detroit book. I'd love to do something like that for Pittsburgh. And so on and so forth. And so it just sort of organically, again, sort of continues. And at a certain point, we had a lot of the Rust Belt covered because the initial idea was to do anthologies of Rust Belt cities. And St. Louis was this big gaping hole. But because we had always sort of proceeded, I think it says a lot if somebody reaches out to you. If somebody is like seeing the work that you've done, thinking about their expertise and their knowledge and saying, hey, I think I could do what these people have already done for this new place, that's a sure sign it's the right fit. But nobody from St. Louis had sent us that email, which is why we had no St. Louis Anthology. And then Ryan was the one who was like, hello, we need this. And I was like, I know, but I'm waiting for someone. And he's like, oh, yeah. And so that's how it happened. Yeah.
That's awesome. And, this is like a little side note, I guess. I feel like, and correct me if I'm wrong, when you started out, it felt like there really was no voice for the Midwest in a literary sense, right? It was truly like considered flyover country. And I know you guys have maybe pushed this a bit, and the reason why it's kind of almost trendy now is partly because you guys have done such a good job giving voice to the Midwest. But it seems like when you started Belt and where we are now, it's like such a different environment with people paying attention to the Midwest. Like I see the New York Times actually flying into St. Louis and eating the food, even the Provel, right?
Yeah, well, that's wonderful to hear. I don't know if we can take much credit, but definitely there was a sense that there was a gap. There was a whole different kind of writing that could be done with, and not at a stretch, very easily could. And I felt like I can help make this happen. There are these great writers. There is this audience for writing like this. I can sort of, we can become that bridge. And our first book was in 2012, published, and we launched Belt Magazine in 2013. And here we are a few years later, and still going strong and growing. And it's the very, very, very best part of my job is attending events like I did last night at Earthbound Brewing and seeing these people who have written these works get together and celebrate it and get to know each other and seeing people buying the books. So, it's great.
Well, I wanted to touch on last night.
Yes.
If you missed it, you should be so sad. It was amazing. It's very difficult. Well, Ryan will back me up on this. It is really hard, even in the age of Facebook, to get people to come out to an event in St. Louis. I feel like it's hard, right? And there were, I saw on the Facebook event, like 300 people had RSVP'd, and I think maybe they all showed up. I mean, it felt like it. Do you guys want to talk a little bit about the event? I thought it was pretty amazing what you guys pulled off yesterday. Well, what everybody pulled off yesterday. It was really poignant.
It was phenomenal. Ryan is the one who really gets all the credit for pulling it off. So I will just say, as an attendee, as someone who got to just show up and participate, it was really moving and fun and raucous and profound. So, Ryan, tell us how you pulled it off.
Well, Belt has release parties like this for all of their books, and I knew there had to be a time for all of the writers to come together and share their work with each other and meet each other. And that was something I knew I wanted to do. And so looking for venues, Earthbound Brewing, there was one of the other contributors connected to them somehow. I knew they had a big space and good beer, and they let us use it for free, so much thanks to them for hosting us graciously like that. When it came to readings, it was really hard to pick who was going to read. I think we landed on about 7 people. Again, that I tried to pick based off the quality, but also making sure it was a good representation of different voices in the book. But the really special part is that over the course of working with these writers, I found out a few of them have special talents other than writing. And Maja Sedikovic, who's a Bosnian poet and has several pieces in the book, is also a traditional Sevda singer, which is a Bosnian folklore music form. and she and her father Edo, a renowned accordionist, is very well known in Europe. Played for us and sang for us, and probably what the most emotionally visceral part of that whole night. And then Nartana Premachandra, who has 2 stories in the piece. Her mother founded Dances of India, which is St. Louis-based, St. Louis founded, and one of the oldest classical Indian dance companies in the United States. And so she performed a dance for us that she had actually written about in the anthology. So it was great, though it wouldn't have been the same without those 2 performing like they
or
did.
Left Bank Books, who sold the books and were a partner with it all along too.
Yeah.
It's great.
So I wanted to touch on Nartana because she had never been published before. She mentioned this fact and I was shocked. And she's got sort of the last word at the end of the book. And I don't want to, no spoilers. You just need to buy it and read it. But I was really, I had crossed paths with her, interviewing her as a journalist, and I had no idea that she wrote. And I thought her pieces were stunning. They were really just precise, but they're funny, it's like everything you hope to do as a writer. So kudos to you guys for finding her. And how did you discover that she wrote? And I'm curious how you found some of the people in the book that are not like writers with a capital W that were really great like how do you find people like that to contribute to something like this?
A lot of the emerging writers in the book, and most of the book is actually emerging writers, I would say. There are very few full-time employed writers that are in this anthology, which I don't think is a bad thing. In fact, I think it's a really good thing because it's a much more representative pool of voices about St. Louis, and I think one would get otherwise. But in Nartana's case, I am also shocked that she had never been published. I didn't know that, actually, until she said that.
Last night?
Yeah.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh my goodness. Wow.
I never met most of these folks in person until last night. I found Nartana because after the call for submissions closed and I had read everything 3 times and made an initial pass at a selection, I was looking for gaps in terms of topics, in terms of representation of different kinds, in terms of we needed a bit more prose. And so I was honestly Googling St. Louis writers and going to the 15th page of results to see who was down there. And I found Nartana's website and emailed her, and she called me and we talked about what the book was going to be and everything, and I asked her to submit a few things, and she did. And there were a few people I reached out to like that after the fact, because I think it took a bit of follow-up after the open call for submissions, a really complete set, and it takes some reaching out to individuals to
you guys had a fairly long submission period. It was opened in February and closed in July of last year.
Yes, and it had been extended a little bit too.
Okay.
And because it was my first time doing anything like this, I now realize I should have been doing that intense outreach in February, in March, April, which was a learning thing for me.
Well, it's a sign of what the reason why this book is so amazing as a book is Ryan. The individual essays are fabulous in and of themselves, but it took a lot of shoe leather to get the mix that he got, and that takes a lot of work. You can also just wait to see who submits, and that's one book. But this is a book that was Ryan reaching out and going to the 15th page of Google to find, something that ends up being, the last essay in the book, which is usually, one of the best. So.
Right.
And similarly, there are 3 Bosnian writers in the anthology, none of whom submitted anything during the open call. And there were no submissions from a Bosnian writer in the open window. And you can't have a St. Louis anthology without anything about Bosnia, and I didn't want it to be someone who's not Bosnian writing about Little Bosnia.
Right.
That was what we wanted to avoid. And so it was researching and reaching out to people. And Maya's poems, if you read them consecutively in the book, is, I think, one of the most compelling narrative arcs in the entire collection. And we only found her because of the follow-up. So
by Googling or reaching out to the Bosnian community directly? Both. Yeah. Because I know there used to be a newspaper in town called La Saba.
Yes.
Yeah, and that's folded, I think. But it was like the Bosnian newspaper for the whole United States. And it was like the New York Times for Bosnians who had
and it
come
was
to the United States.
The same parent company that does Yo Bahar in St. Louis, which is still active, I believe.
On WIL, probably, yeah.
I don't know about the newspaper.
Right, I think it's folded, but if it comes back and you do this again...
Yeah, exactly.
Well, I'm going backwards, but I wanted to touch on Galen as well, because I feel like he's not really a known entity always in the community in terms of, like, there's poets whose names come up over and over again. I don't feel like his does, and I was so happy when I opened the book and I saw the acknowledgement to all of the tribes who had lived here before, or they got, like, you know, pushed out by colonists, and to have his poem opening the anthology and basically explaining to people that the arch is a big monument to manifest destiny. I found that very powerful, and I, you know, so to touch on Galen as well. He was the first reader last night too. So
another post-open call for submissions contributor. There are, I think, 3 Native writers in the anthology, which their work came about because I reached out to the Native American Center at Washington University, and there was no better opening to the book than his poem, in terms of looking at the city differently than I think the dominant narratives would have one do.
So to get into the guts of the book now that we've done the last piece and the first piece, there were a couple of pieces that, well, Natana stood out to me, and I had just about fainted, of course, when she was like, I've never published. Well, for instance, I wanted to touch on the piece about the Japanese garden at the Botanical Garden, because I feel like the Japanese garden and the Japanese festival is something that people really take for granted in St. Louis, and they don't think about where it came from. And I think also, now that we're in the midst of all this horrible stuff with the detention centers, and, you know, like, we're almost right back where we started with this stuff in this country. And so I feel like that's a really important essay. But of course, when you solicited that or received it, I mean, the detention centers and ICE weren't front and center in the national narrative, I don't think. Last year, at least not as much as they are now.
That was one of the last pieces to come together. I worked with the Shimamoto brothers, who are all, I think they're all engineers. They're not writers. I helped them write their piece. That didn't come up. Not because we avoided it, but I think they wanted to focus more on their parents.
On their family. Well, that's appropriate. I mean, that's what that piece is about. But it has a real resonance right now.
Yeah. It does. History repeats it over and over.
And the Kinloch piece, I thought, was very poignant too, because I feel like there's a stereotype of Kinloch being a certain way, and it completely contradicts the current incorrect narrative about what Kinloch was. And
I think everyone in St. Louis, I think, knows what Kinloch's reputation is without knowing what Kinloch is and was to the people who lived there. And the change, you know, growing up, I never knew anything else about Kinloch besides what I was told about it, and not to go there. And what's left out is that something happened to that community that made it the ways that no one ever talks about, and those people were displaced, and their story matters and their voice matters. And that was a similar thing of finding people who could write that story themselves and not just having pieces written about them by someone else.
So how did you find Stephen T. Bowles? He's the fellow at the church.
Yes. He's the pastor at a church there. I had interviewed him for an article I wrote for Al Jazeera years ago, and we've been in touch ever since. And so when this came together, he and there's another pastor from North County who have another piece in there, Alonzo Adams, who I'd also interviewed. That's how we know them. They write sermons, so I thought they could write stories.
And they turned out to be very true.
Good.
Yeah, I love that piece. So I also wanted to touch on, I mean, there's sort of these Venn diagrams that happen too in the book. Like you have the Muslim community, and some of it is Middle Eastern, and some of it is Bosnian, and
Right.
you know, and they're not always exactly, they overlap, but they're not always exactly the same thing. And I think that this anthology gets at that, but while getting at the commonalities. Like I'm just thinking of the fact that in a lot of those essays, there's this recurring theme of the community pooling resource for one family or one cause, or I was wondering if you could touch on some. I was thinking of the Jordanian kids.
Right,
like that was like
Jordanian
such an
kids.
affecting piece. So, okay. So yeah, I mean, well, actually, I was curious how you found Layla, how you found her.
Yeah. Layla, I sent out a blanket email, kind of BCC, all the English, creative writing, literature departments at all the universities in St. Louis. And I don't know how it got to her, but her submission came from that particular email blast.
An email blast. You guys got sophisticated.
Yeah.
And I also wanted to touch on Deborah Jackson Taffa's piece,
Yes.
because I feel like I loved that piece anyway, and it brings together so many different things. It brings the
Right.
suburbs in a really unexpected way, because Chesterfield is not the Chesterfield you think it is, just like North County isn't what I think it is, and she's a native person, and she writes from that perspective, but she's also writing from this place of being a suburban housewife. I mean, there were just so many interesting things going on in that piece, and it was so visceral too.
Right. And what struck me most about her piece, in addition to all those things you mentioned, she's writing around this particular event where the lake bottomed out and drained overnight, and it was this bizarre ecological moment for that community. But what struck me is that she writes, again from the native perspective, but suddenly having to be the transmitter of cultural knowledge to her children so far from her community because she's from the Southwest, and struggling with having to feel empowered to do that, or struggling by not feeling empowered to do that, because if she were back home, that would not be her role. It'd be the role of elders and grandparents. And that's just I think a really poignant voice of a St. Louis transplant that just it added a lot to the story, I think.
Because like the native perspective never gets addressed in St. Louis. I never, ever, ever hear people talking about that, ever. And I've been here since 2001, and it never comes up, which is obscene, right?
And one thing I learned in doing this anthology was that the native community here was very robust last century. There was an era, I think in the 50s and 60s, of federal policy that was terminating treaties, and reservation boundaries were changing, and there were creating incentives for Native people to move to cities, and in some cases buying bus tickets and train tickets for people, and St. Louis was one of those cities.
Wow,
And
I had no idea.
And now most people, I understand, went from St. Louis to Chicago in the end, where there's I think there's tons of Native folks in Chicago today. But they're called kind of relocation cities, and St. Louis was one last century, and there used to be powwows every year. I'm not sure if they continue anymore.
I think people have to drive to Oklahoma. That's what I hear from people.
Right.
So.
And growing up here as a white person, the best perspective I ever got was Cahokia Mounds. And the Osage lived here. That was it. And that's not even the truth. It was the Osage, the Miami, the Illini Confederacy, which is about half a dozen individual tribes together.
Right.
We never talked about that, really.
Not at all.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And Galen's poem made me look at the arch completely differently, because every time, you've heard me say it, every time we see the arch, we say, hey, there's the arch. It's like reflexive, but it means something entirely different than we're taught it is.
Right.
Right? And suddenly becomes very insidious.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So I have two other essays I want to talk about for very particular. Well, they're great, like everything else in the anthology, but I'm bringing them up for specific reasons. I wanted to talk about Vivian Gibson's piece, because to touch on Mill Creek and and projects associated with that. So
Yes. Vivian's was actually the very first submission
really,
in the
wow.
entire thing. I have no idea how she got it. I don't know how it got to her. I barely sent out any emails, but she emailed me, and she just had sent the one, sun up to sundown, and I read it, and I, in my head, said, holy crap, and I emailed her back, and I was like, you said this is one of your memoirs. Do you have more? And she sent me about 6. And originally there were going to be 3, but I pushed Belt's word count limit and then resisted the command to pull back a little bit. And because by then we had found out that Belt would be publishing Vivian's complete memoirs in 2020, I did not feel so bad asking Vivian if she would be okay with just the one piece instead of 3. But I think it is one of the most memorable stories to me in the whole collection. And it's so simply written. The prose is so simple, so clear, and it's not even that long, but it somehow just, in the very last paragraph, like rips your heart out in a way you don't expect it to.
Yeah, no spoilers.
Yeah,
you
no
just have to
spoilers.
read it. And then I wanted to touch on Chris Ando's piece as well, which
Yes.
Chris is
He's prolific.
awesome. Yeah, I love Chris. And he's a great reader. He did a job last night, but you are doing another anthology as well, right? LGBTQ anthology.
Yes,
Yeah, okay.
of the Midwest.
Of the Midwest,
And Upper
which is
Appalachia.
amazing. So, yeah. So we can touch on Chris, and then we can touch on the anthology, maybe? Yeah.
Chris also was one of the very first submissions. Again, not sure how he saw it. It was like 48 hours after
Chris
it had gone
sees
up.
everything.
Yeah.
Chris is a horizon scanner of the most amazing sort. So,
But he had submitted 2 originally, and they were. I asked him to combine them into one. It was about Midnight Annie and about Clementine's closing day, and I said these are similar enough. He wanted because I want both, and he did that. And then there were a couple other LGBTQ writers that submitted things from very different perspectives. Samuel Altman wrote a very compelling piece about growing up gay in the Kojic Church in North St. Louis, and he read last night as well. His piece, Consuming Buyers, is very good. And Rachel Brand has a poem about what the grove means to her as a young lesbian in St. Louis. But Chris, I wouldn't say those 3 kind of started the ball rolling for the other anthology. It was a combination of things, but I'm from St. Louis, obviously. The LGBTQ anthology has a co-editor who's from Chicago. He went to school in rural Wisconsin for college. And we have a lot of conversations about representing and queer experiences in flyover country, and had tossed some ideas back and forth with Ann.
Who I was very, very resistant.
And what?
I was not.
Yeah.
I did not think it was a good idea, and Ryan kept just knocking on the door and was like, "Okay, I'm gonna try again here," and I'd be like, "Nope," and it's like, "Okay, try one more time." I was like, I just finally just gave up. I'm like, "Fine." And then we put out the call for submissions, and suddenly, everyone in the world is excited and sharing it. I'm like, okay, I guess Ryan was right all along.
Yeah, that call for submissions is still open until October. I think we're talking about fall of next year. I think fall of 2020.
And this is anyone in the Midwest.
All like Midwest, Appalachia, Great Plains, Rust Belt. We got an email from Idaho asking if that counted, because
Idaho
socially it was the same as like North Dakota, and I was
I'm from Utah, and I'm like on the fence about that. I've spent a lot of time in Idaho. I don't know, but
I said submit it and we'll see.
Yeah, that's the best answer.
Yeah.
That's a good answer.
But not the one from San Francisco.
No,
Definitely saying no to that one.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's pushing it just a bit.
The response has been great. There's lots of poems, very heavy on the poetry. So if you are a LGBTQ writer in the Midwest listening to this and write anything other than poems, beltpublishing.com has the submission information. But I think we're going to end up with a really stellar collection. The things we've gotten so far are brilliant, and everything we wanted it to be. It's going to be good.
Well, just kind of preview I got. I mean, Samuel's piece really affected me too. I was like blown away. I hope he writes a whole book, is what I hope. I would buy that book. So I'm excited for that. So that's 2020 as well. Later in 2020, or
that'll be like say a year and a half from now.
Okay, so a lot to look forward to. Yeah. Are there pieces we have not touched on that you guys wanted to make sure? Oh my gosh. Okay, yes, there is something. Normandy. So I wanted to touch on the because we're sitting right now in a city that is celebrating a Stanley Cup win, and there have been 6 kids who have been shot on the streets of St. Louis in as many days. I mean, it's just, and I think this is one of the things that this anthology gets to so brilliantly without being ham-handed about it. I mean, it's like these contradictions here, but that piece, well, it's a lot of little pieces from Normandy students talking about guns and how and violence and how they experience it.
Right.
So do you want to touch a little bit? How did you find Inda? Like, she was the one who curated.
Yes,
she's the
teacher. So going into this, of course, everything that happened in Ferguson and North County needed to be addressed in some way. And just having read a lot during that time and having written some during that time when it was going on, I was trying to think of voices that hadn't really been amplified. And I thought about young people, Mike Brown's contemporaries, students, and I reached out to Normandy, which is the school that graduated him, and I reached out to the district through their PR person at the district level, told them about the project very vaguely. They sent me to Inda. I explained the project in more detail to her, and everything that they wrote, they didn't write that for this anthology. Those are things they've written themselves in school already. These are the things that they are already talking about. This was just a platform for that. Those particular pieces were a sampling of her class. It wasn't everyone. There were too many, sadly, to include all of them. They were done in response to the Parkland shooting. Right after that happened, she asked her students to kind of do a cathartic write about gun violence, and that's some of what came back.
Well, I'm sure Ferguson was a difficult thing to wrangle, but because that's what people think about when they think about St. right now, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It was, and it was about, again, trying to find those voices that hadn't really been amplified during that time, because there was so much written about St. Louis, largely not by people in or from St. Louis, let alone from North County. And so that was the impetus for also reaching out to Steve Peebles and Alonzo Adams, who were pastors in Kinloch and Ferguson, and talking about them in that time and their reflections on all of that.
Right. And the mirror casket, you had to get the mirror casket in there because that is very important.
Yes. And also there's a poem in there written by a teacher in St. Louis, a white teacher to her black students. And it's, I am blanking on the title.
I can look it up if
yes.
you like. Yeah, I know about where it is.
Yeah.
It's later in the... Oh, I wanted to touch on Kirsty Pemberton too.
We can,
so it's back here in the back.
Yeah.
Okay.
Caitlin Delvo.
Yeah. To AG in the third row.
Yes.
Is the title. Yeah.
That came in independent of any outreach. It was very poignant. The perspective of the teacher really moved me. Just thinking about the Normandy students as well. And,
right. And the cell phone story. The cell phone...
Jaywalking.
Yes. That one in particular, I think gets at a lot of the crux of the issue. Like all the iPhones are in the safe, but what about the people?
Which is really what dominated the discourse about what was going on in North County that year. The outrage for most of St. Louis was on the destruction of property. And that story really hits at that.
Right.
The concern of that store was protecting the merchandise, but their employee asking for another light in the parking lot for when they close at night was
nope.
too much. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I have family up in North County, and I was shocked by that essay. So, so there's an essay by a young girl who is no longer
with us.
My brain tumor, and she lived near the Westlake landfill, which is the other, I think. I mean, it seems to go out in the media all the time, and there's like no response.
Yes.
I mean, it's been in Rolling Stone. Like Aaron Brockovich came out here, and like nothing happens.
Nothing happens. Yeah, I know Kirsty's mother because I've written about Coldwater Creek and the Westlake landfill and the legacy of the Manhattan Project in St. Louis pretty extensively, and have gotten a lot of the families that live around there. And Kirsty's mom, and I have met several times over the years. I've interviewed her before, and it was, again, I wanted that story had to be told or represented, but I didn't want it to be someone writing about it. And I knew her daughter had passed away long before I had met her. And when they have these public meetings, Kirby brings that story her daughter wrote for her class, and there's pictures too. The pictures weren't in there, but it's like a little picture book about when she had been diagnosed with brain cancer. And what gets me about that the most is she wrote that probably, like, now we know the statistics of brain cancer in children in her zip code, and it's obscene.
Well,
and it's it just had to be in. It had to, yeah.
Well, I think in the piece it notes that particular type of brain cancer usually is only diagnosed in elderly men.
Yeah.
So that should have been read right there, right? Yeah. Maybe we can wrap up with Humans of St. Louis. Or is there anything else you want to touch on before we talk about the humans?
Oh, gosh. I hope you all read the book. Yeah.
I hope you all buy copies of the book.
Yeah. Well, we should give people the website again so they know where to get it and where they can get it here in St. Louis, too. Love Bank Books, I'm assuming, is the place. Yeah.
Love Bank Books. I guess one thing, I got this question a lot last night. There were 120 submissions that came in.
That's not that many, really.
It's actually, I thought it was quite a lot.
Oh, okay.
And I think it ended up being just over 60 that made it into the anthology. So the city is ready for more projects like this. Just
that's a prompt if you missed it.
I got it.
Yeah.
Well, you and everybody else who's walking around in St. Louis right now.
Right.
I mean, because you started you did this because you saw a need for it, and so it's you just did it.
Right.
Yeah.
Anyone. I'm happy to talk with anyone who wants to publish more stories about St. Louis themselves. For sure.
Yeah. So Humans of St. Louis, you want to talk about?
Yeah.
I follow them on Facebook. I'm a big fan. They're also producing their own book right now. That is near completion, a photo book. But this was another thing that I pestered Ann and the folks at Belt about, was including pictures. And I'm persistent.
I'm looking back now and realizing you've just been playing a song, haven't you? On so many levels.
It all comes out.
Yeah. I think, of course, there's a lot of power in writing and good writing, but I felt it really important to see people's faces too. That was really the impetus behind asking them to be a part of this. And I had them send a selection, and we narrowed it down to a few that we both agreed on, thinking about representation of various kinds. And I think it's a great little break of the reading to see those portraits, and also to see that people here are happy too. That's what struck me about those photos too.
Anything you want to add to that, Ann?
I mean, I thought the beauty of the book is that it doesn't dodge any tough questions or difficulties that maybe the city dodges too often. but there is so much love in the book. Not just love for the city in some boosterish way, but in the way that you love your family. That sometimes you hate them. That all of the stories and all of the people who are writing about it, they're coming from such a deep and important and good place in their relationship to the city. And any city that doesn't listen to those stories and think about how invested these people are in the city is missing a tremendous asset.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, well, maybe that's a good place to wrap it up. I thought it was pretty fly as
as Nartana said.
As Nartana said, yeah, exactly. So belt.com, right?
Beltpublishing.com.
Beltpublishing.com, yes.
Yep. And maybe we'll even have a little discount code once we edit this, right? If you hear this podcast and you go to
STL Speaks or something with a hash.
Exactly. Yep.
And I also know some of the writers. So I live in Chicago now. So I'm not here as much as I would like. And some of the writers are interested in doing more events around the anthology, readings, panels, and things. So keep an eye out for those as well.
Yep. Well, thank you guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.